When the photograph was first invented, the exposure time was in hours rather than minutes. Anything that moved in front of the camera lens just wasn't recorded. But when the exposure time became a matter of seconds, movement began to make an appearance. Those smudges are people on a bridge in Paris. And that haze above the pavement, pedestrians in Glasgow. This handcart had moved halfway through the exposure. So once exposures were no longer just a matter of whipping your cap off and on the lens, and mechanical shutters allowed an exposure time of less than a second, then it became possible to observe what had never been seen before, a sequence of rapid motion.
Today, we use photography to see where a horse's nose is. But 100 years ago, they were more anxious to see where the horse's legs were. Now, what a horse does with its legs when it's galloping had always puzzled people, especially artists, because the galloping legs moved just too fast for the human eye. Now, have you noticed that when a horse gallops, its hoofbeats come in 3? Well, assuming the horse has got 4 legs, that must mean that 2 hooves are hitting the ground together. But which 2? Now, this was a kind of research which photography moved into and which eventually led to the revolution in still pictures, the invention of moving pictures, the movies. And the French scientist who first started the investigation was Professor Marey.
Marey was a medical man, fascinated by all forms of movement, and he invented all sorts of instruments to investigate motion. This is a sphigometer to measure the pulse rates of people in action. A hollow chamber in the sole of a running shoe to measure how long the foot was in contact with the ground. A dynamographic platform to measure the height of different jumps. For Marey, everything that moved was there to be measured. Nothing was too difficult, not even the beats of a pigeon's wing. On horses, a rubber ball stuffed with horsehair was fixed to each shoe and connected by a rubber tube to a device held by the rider. It measured any change in pressure and showed the order in which the hooves touched the ground. Using these results, an artist drew horses walking and trotting and galloping, but there was no evidence that he'd got the position of the legs right. As Marey observed, science has 2 obstacles to its progress: the ineffectiveness of our senses to discover the truths, and the inadequacy of language to communicate those truths that we have discovered. But in 1878, the French paper La Nature published proof of sequential positions of horses in motion in the form of photographs made by a Mr. Muybridge in America. These are the Yosemite Falls in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. These mountains attracted some of the best of the early American landscape photographers. And it was here too that an Englishman, Edward Muybridge, made his worldwide reputation as a landscape photographer. The Yosemite Valley has an awesome beauty. It was an area of mystical significance to the Indians. Muybridge photographed it in 1867 and again in 1872. Work like this led the government to hire Muybridge to photograph Alaska, which the Americans had just bought for a bargain $7.5 million from the Russians. This is the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in the capital, Sitka. The Lighthouse Board and other government agencies also hired Muybridge, and by 1872 he was established as the most eminent landscape photographer on the West Coast, giving rich, culture-hungry Californians artistic photo compositions. As one writer put it, by the 1860s, San Francisco had made a vast, inspiring stride from the barbarism of the gold rush to vulgarity. This trade card for his associated company, Bradley and Rollifson, claimed with typical Californian modesty that it had more rooms, greater facilities, finer photographs, and the only elevator connected with a photographic gallery in the world. Then, In 1874, Muybridge achieved notoriety, not through photography, but because of a personal tragedy. 2 years earlier, he'd married Flora Stone, a 21-year-old divorcee. Pretty and vivacious, she'd often modelled for him. But while he was away on photographic trips, she had an affair with a dashing Scots emigre and conman called Major Harry Larkins. Flora had a child. Sometime later, Muybridge found out that he was not the father, so he tracked Larkins down to a ranch house of the Yellow Jacket mine. He knocked on the door, and when Larkins answered it, Muybridge shot him dead. It was a famous trial. The defense called witnesses to establish the plea of insanity. What sane man, one argued, would pose on the edge of a rock 3,400 feet above the valley floor just to make a picture more interesting? Muybridge's actions had in fact been cool and calculated, but the jury acquitted him on the grounds of justifiable homicide. Muybridge then left the country until the fuss died down. He came back in 1875 and renewed work with the man who had sponsored the first photographic analysis of motion, Leland Stanford, a millionaire, ex-governor of California, and an expert horse breeder. Stanford had commissioned Muybridge back in 1872 and 3 to try and find out if a trotting horse ever had all its 4 legs off the ground. And now, on Stanford's Californian stud farm, they set about finding out in earnest. Over the next few years, Stanford spent $42,000 in providing the facilities for the first photographic investigation into the movement of horses. Muybridge needed as much light as possible to record an image because of the high-speed shutters he had to use. So, on the left, a cotton reflector. The ground was covered with limestone to reflect the light. And on the right, there was a 50-foot-long camera house and a darkroom. 12 new cameras were brought in from New York and the special lenses from London. They designed their own shutters powered by rubber bands, and as one shutter passed the other, there was a gap of only 1/500th of a second. The shutters were released electrically, either by a horse snapping a thread or by the metal wheels of a carriage passing over wires on the ground and completing the circuit. On June the 18th, 1878, the press were invited to see the results of the experiment. They reported enthusiastically that for the first time, movement too rapid for the eye to see had been caught in the fraction of a second. Silhouettes were published showing a horse with all 4 legs off the ground. Muybridge then went to work on the human body, using members of the Olympic Club of San Francisco as his models. By now, Muybridge was being recognized as a leading researcher into movement. In 1878, a series of cards called The Horse in Motion was published, and they were reproduced around the world. It was these photographs that had so excited Professor Murray in France. Murray asked to be put in contact with Muybridge, and when Muybridge visited Paris on a lecture tour in 1881, he stayed with Professor Murray for 6 months. Murray started his photographic work at what he called his physiological station, set in a park on the outskirts of Paris. There was a 3-sided building known as the Black Hole. Above it, there was a gantry for the top shots, and a white mobile darkroom cum camera car facing the Black Hole. Inside this car was a camera with a new type of shutter, a disc with a slot in it, which rotated in front of the lens and allowed a number of exposures to be superimposed upon a single fixed plate. The path of a bouncing ball. A weight accelerating under gravity. The best results were achieved by having a black velvet background, no dust to reflect the light, and moving objects that were white. But when the moving objects were slow, the images merged. This is in fact an elephant. To overcome this problem, Marey put together a photographic gun in 1882. The barrel was aimed at the moving objects. 12 springs rotated a glass plate on which a separate exposure was made each time the plate stopped. It was in its way a kind of movie camera, one of the first steps towards cinema. At this time, Muybridge was showing his slides to the learned societies of Europe. He showed how inaccurate the conventional artist representation of movement had been, compared to the facts as shown by the Californian experiments. To convince his audience that the apparently unreal positions in his photos were part of a sequence of movement, Muybridge had gone on to project his pictures, and he devised a machine which would recreate that movement. If you take the separate stills of a movement and project them fast enough so that one replaces the other within 1/12 of a second, then the eye will see that as a continuous and fluid movement. It's called persistence of vision. Persistence of vision was the principle behind a whole range of Victorian toys. In fact, many of these optical devices were labelled educational toys. That presumably was to help sales because it meant they could be safely played with during the long Victorian Sabbaths. This is one of the first. It came out in 1823. It's got a cage on one side and a bird on the other. And when you twirl it, the bird ends up inside the cage. It's called the thaumatrope. Now, these are bands for this machine here. It's called the Wheel of Life. As you can see, the bands are very crudely drawn, and that's important. They weren't photographs. But what you did was you put the band inside the machine like so, and turned it and looked at it through these slots. This was probably the most popular of all the optical toys, known today as the zoetrope. This one is the praxinoscope. A drum of mirrors reflected the images placed inside the rim. These are flicker cards, the same principle as the mutoscope, that what the butler saw machine. So, when it came to producing motion pictures, the principles were well understood, and they had this whole range of optical devices. All they needed now were photographs of motion, and that, of course, is what Muybridge had. So, in the autumn of 1879, he used a machine which was a sophisticated version of this one here to produce motion. He called it the zoopraxiscope. And this is it, the original zoopraxiscope. This model is now in the museum of Muybridge's hometown of Kingston upon Thames. The ironical thing was that when Muybridge came to revolve these discs with these photographs on them, the horses didn't look normal. They looked squashed because of the optical effect. So Muybridge had to employ a painter to put the horses' images back on again. Now the legs are in the right position, but the body, if you look closely, has been specially stretched so that it would look normal, at least on projection. In front of this disc, he counter-rotated another disc with slots cut in it, which allowed the picture to flicker into life. But while Muybridge was lecturing, he was also trying to arouse interest in his next and most ambitious project.
What he wanted to do was to compile a vast dictionary, a visual dictionary of all kinds of animal and human motion. He thought it might be of interest to artists and scientists. And he finally got that sponsorship from the University of Pennsylvania in America.
The university was keen to establish its credentials, and so, at the age of 54, Muybridge became an academic. The University of Pennsylvania produced 5 sponsors with $5,000 apiece. This ambitious experiment took place in the courtyard of the veterinary department. The setup was similar to California. 24 cameras in a white shed, but this time 2 extra sets of 12 cameras on either side. And all the cameras were now operated electrically. In all, 26,000 stills were published, illustrating 781 examples of movement. The complete work, called Animal Locomotion, came to 11 volumes and cost $600. The subjects were shot from 3 sides, 24 sequential stills from the center, another 12 from the left, and another 12 from the right. We've put them together. Most of the male models came from the university. The ladies ranged from society matrons to dancers from the local theatre. They were chosen for the grace of their movement. While the men sported, the women's routine was more domestic. The models and their movements were all carefully documented. This is Model 95, described as an ex-athlete. It was Muybridge himself. Muybridge also made a series which took the subject simultaneously from 6 different angles. medical department was one of the sponsors. This series was taken so that students could observe malfunctions in the human body. Muybridge spent the remaining years of his life trying to promote his work on animal locomotion. But when the cinema appeared, his lectures lost their appeal. He died in Kingston upon Thames on the 8th of May, 1904. His old friend, Professor Murray, died just a week later. He had continued his use of photography in scientific investigations, in particular original research into aerodynamics, photographing smoke trails around various shapes. Murray's assistant, Demeny, had tried to persuade Murray to adapt their camera projector, the Chronophotographique, to show films. Murray refused. Yet this camera projector is very much a prototype of the movie camera, able to reproduce movement. It used wax paper or celluloid, several meters in length. In theory, they could have had 40 or 50 seconds worth of film. But Murray was only interested in the scientific analysis of motion. And even if you put together today his film, it only gives a single repeated action. Well, those simple repeated sequences were just a preview of things to come. Once celluloid was put to use as the flexible backing for strips of photographs, it was only a matter of time before someone invented the cinema. And quite a few people claimed they had. In America, it was the inventor Thomas Edison. Germany's pioneer was Ottomar Anschutz. British claimants included William Fries Green, whose tombstone describes him rather wishfully as the inventor of kinematography. In fact, most of the technical problems had been solved by an engineer from Leeds called Augustin Le Prince. But he disappeared mysteriously in 1890 while traveling through his native France, and he was never seen again. But whatever its disputed parentage, the cinema was certainly given its public baptism in France. In Paris, in 1895, two brothers called Louis and Auguste Lumière put on the first ever film show before a paying audience. One scene showed the workers leaving the Lumière's factory. The audiences were, of course, enthralled by the new medium of moving film. The dominance of the still photograph was at an end. But what Muybridge, Murray, and all those other Victorian photographers had given was a new way of seeing. That first half-century of photography produced a remarkable range of images, capturing the appearance of the era and handing it down as a visual record, a record that only the camera could have made.